Welcome to Revenge Oath, a bizarre announcement and a fraternity of red-haired men. What secret are they hiding? Your comments make this journey special. Where are you following us from? Let's dive right into the mystery. It was upon a languid autumn afternoon, with the fog rolling sluggishly across Baker Street, that I found Holmes in one of his most characteristic moods. He lay at full length upon the settee, his long, nervous fingers steepled together beneath his sharp chin, his hawk-like gaze fixed upon the ceiling as though it concealed some cipher invisible to common eyes. The air was thick with the blue haze of his pipe, and from time to time he muttered a phrase under his breath, an unfinished sequence of logic that seemed to circle within his own mind. I had been immersed in the day's newspaper, a matter of idle distraction, when a curious advertisement caught my attention. Its peculiar wording stirred in me a sense of the unusual, and I could not help but read it aloud to my companion. To the red-headed men of London, the League of the Red-Headed requests your immediate application. Ample salary and easy hours. Apply in person at 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street, between the hours of 10 and 2. Holmes's eyes flickered at once with that quick light which told me he had fastened upon a trail, however slight. He rose swiftly, snatching the paper from my hands, and perused the notice with an intensity I had often seen precede his most remarkable deductions. "Watson," he said at length, in that quiet yet commanding tone that brooked no argument, "here we have the germ of a problem most singular in its conception. What honest employment is ever offered with such restrictions? Red hair as a qualification, the hours fixed between 10 and 2. The very wording suggests a contrivance, a bait for some larger design." Before I could reply, our landlady announced a visitor. A stout gentleman, middle-aged and florid of complexion, entered the sitting-room with a manner both humble and anxious. His hair, of a fiery hue rarely seen in such abundance, instantly proclaimed him the very embodiment of the advertisement. He introduced himself as Jabez Wilson, a pawnbroker of some standing in Saxe-Coburg Square, and within moments was pouring out his tale in earnest. It seemed that, enticed by the strange advertisement, he had presented himself at Pope's Court to discover a queue of men equally endowed with ruddy locks. By some fortune, or so it appeared, he had been chosen above the rest and inducted into what was styled the Red-Headed League. His duties were curious: to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica each day in longhand within the League's offices. For this labour he was paid a most handsome wage, yet forbidden to absent himself between the appointed hours. The situation, though at first a blessing, soon struck him as odd. 2 months had passed in this monotonous employment when, without warning, he arrived one morning to find the office shuttered, a notice posted upon the door. "The Red-Headed League is dissolved." No explanation was offered, nor had he since been able to trace the benefactors of this mysterious society. As Wilson concluded his narrative, his ruddy face flushed with indignation, Holmes leaned forward in his chair, his keen features alight with suppressed excitement. I knew the signs well. The great engine of his mind had been set in motion. "My dear sir," Holmes remarked, "you have indeed been most egregiously wronged, though I fancy the wrong lies not in the loss of your stipend, but in something far more sinister. Pray indulge me with every detail of your association, the offices, the clerks, your own establishment in Saxe-Coburg Square." "Omit nothing, however trifling it may appear." Wilson consented, and as he spoke, Holmes's penetrating questions cut like a scalpel into the heart of the matter. I, for my part, could scarcely see more than an eccentric hoax designed to prey upon a man's vanity in his unusual colouring. Yet from the gleam in Holmes's eyes I felt certain that this curious league was but the outer husk of a deeper conspiracy. Thus was the stage set for what would prove to be one of the most singular adventures to grace the annals of Baker Street, an affair that began with a red head and a peculiar advertisement, and ended in revelations as astonishing as any that ever passed before my pen. Holmes had listened to Wilson's account with the closest attention, and as the man departed, still lamenting the inexplicable loss of his sinecure, my companion remained silent for some minutes, his eyes half closed, the smoke from his pipe curling lazily about his head. I had come to recognize that this silence was no mark of indifference, but rather the outward sign of an inward storm of conjecture, each possibility tested, discarded, or preserved within that remarkable mind. "Watson," he said suddenly, springing to his feet with a vigour that startled me, "there is no time to lose." This matter bears the unmistakable stamp of deep-laid cunning. I will accompany Mr. Wilson to his establishment at Saxe-Coburg Square without delay. Your company will be invaluable. As always, I assented with eagerness, for the case had already assumed in my mind the peculiar fascination which attended all Holmes's adventures. Within the half-hour we had hailed a hansom and were rattling through the busy streets of London, the grey mist clinging to the lamps and the cries of costermongers echoing dimly in the distance. Saxe-Coburg Square proved to be a dingy but respectable enclave, with narrow houses enclosing a small, paved yard. Wilson's pawnshop occupied the corner, its windows cluttered with watches, violins, and the melancholy assortment of bric-a-brac that marks such establishments. Holmes surveyed the scene with that swift, comprehensive glance of his, noting not only the shop but the adjoining structures and the pattern of traffic in the little square. Inside, Wilson introduced us to his assistant, a quick-eyed fellow by the name of Vincent Spaulding. He was a man of small stature, with a white splash upon his forehead, and possessed of a singular energy that seemed at odds with his menial duties. Holmes contrived to engage him in conversation, complimenting him upon the cleanliness of the shop and the orderliness of the accounts. Spaulding received the praise with modesty, yet I could not help but observe the glint of amusement that lingered in his eyes, as though he were party to some private jest. Holmes, for his part, appeared absorbed in trifles. He examined the pavement outside, tapped the flagstones with his stick, and measured the breadth of the shop with an exactness that seemed to me unnecessary. Even within the shop he cast his gaze not upon the articles for sale, but upon the skirting of the walls, the position of the cellar door, and the thickness of the flooring. I confess that though accustomed to his methods, I could make nothing of these peculiar attentions. When at length we had taken our leave of Wilson, Holmes led me out into the square once more. He halted abruptly, and I saw his keen eyes sweep from one building to the next, until they rested upon a considerable bank that stood immediately behind the pawnshop, its solid masonry and iron-bound doors exuding an air of impregnability. "Ha, ha!" he exclaimed softly, more to himself than to me. "The matter grows clearer with each step. Watson, did you observe the knees of that assistant's trousers?" I was forced to confess that I had not. They were worn, my dear fellow, worn and soiled in a manner that bespoke hours spent upon them in some confined space. Add to this the hollow sound of the floorboards and the bank contiguous to the pawnshop, and you may begin to perceive the outline of the design. I gasped, for even then a dreadful possibility suggested itself. Holmes pressed his lips together, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "The red-headed league was but a blind," he continued, lowering his voice. "Its purpose was to remove Wilson from his premises at regular hours, leaving the assistant unobserved. 2 months of such seclusion would suffice for the completion of almost any subterranean enterprise. What is the most valuable objective in the vicinity? Plainly the bank at the rear. We must assume that a tunnel is in progress. The magnitude of the scheme struck me with sudden force. Here was no eccentric prank, but a carefully wrought conspiracy, promising both danger and daring. "Holmes," I cried, "surely we must act at once." A word to Scotland Yard. He laid a restraining hand upon my arm. "Patience, Watson. A premature alarm may defeat our very purpose. We must ascertain the precise point of attack and the intended moment of execution. Only then may we descend upon them with certainty. For the present, let us turn our attention elsewhere, for I have no doubt our quarry is alert to the slightest suspicion." With that he hailed another cab and gave the driver an address in Fleet Street. As we jolted along, I pressed him for further enlightenment, but he smiled in that infuriatingly serene manner of his. "All in good time," he said. "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. We have a few, it is true, but not yet enough. Let us therefore acquire more." We alighted near the spot where Wilson had first encountered the mysterious league. Holmes scrutinized the building, noting the worn steps, the dusty windows, and the brass plate that still bore the name of the league upon its door. A passer-by informed us that the premises had been let for only a short term, and that the tenants had departed suddenly, leaving no trace of their business. Holmes received this confirmation without surprise. Indeed, I fancied that his every observation only strengthened the conviction already forming in his mind. He led me then into a neighbouring tavern where, ensconced in a quiet corner, he produced his notebook and sketched rapidly upon a page the outline of Saxe-Coburg Square, the pawnshop, and the adjacent bank. He marked the probable course of the tunnel and the points of weakness in the bank's defences. "Tonight," he declared, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar light I had come to associate with the chase, "we shall return to Saxe-Coburg Square. But not alone, Watson. I must enlist the cooperation of the authorities, though in such a manner that they serve rather than hinder us. This is a case that will test their patience, but I fancy they shall have their reward ere morning." I looked upon the sketch and shuddered at the audacity of the plan it revealed. The very air of London seemed thick with hidden menace, and I marvelled anew at the genius of my friend, who could read from the most trivial of clues the dark designs that lurked beneath. As we left the tavern, Holmes turned to me with that dry humour that ever tempered his intensity. "You see, Watson, how even a man's hair colour may become the instrument of fate. There is poetry in criminal ingenuity if one has the eyes to perceive it." I could but nod, my thoughts racing ahead to the night that awaited us, when we should pit ourselves once more against the shadowy forces of crime that prowled unceasingly through the fog of London. Holmes lost no time in putting his intention into action. That same evening, after a hasty dinner at Baker Street, he dispatched a note by messenger, and before long Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was seated in our sitting-room, his compact figure and sharp manner bringing with them an air of officialdom that contrasted strongly with Holmes's languid ease. Lestrade was no stranger to our adventures, and though he often met Holmes with a scepticism born of wounded pride, I had observed in him a growing respect for my friend's powers. Holmes unfolded to him the outlines of the affair with an economy of words that nevertheless conveyed the gravity of the situation. Lestrade's eyebrows rose as he heard of the league, the pawnshop, and the bank that lay conveniently adjacent. "A tunnel, you say?" he remarked, pursing his lips. "It sounds a far-fetched notion, Mr. Holmes. Still, I've seen you prove stranger things. Who is this assistant? Spaulding, did you call him?" "Vincent Spaulding," Holmes repeated, "a man of intelligence to judge by his bearing, yet content to work at half wages. His trousers show the wear of constant kneeling, and his manner betrays an amused confidence. "Tell me, Lestrade, have you heard of him before?" Lestrade tapped his finger against his chin. "No, but I'll have the records checked. London's a large place, and a man like that doesn't always leave footprints behind. Still, if there's villainy brewing, it must be carefully laid. The bank, you say, is your object of suspicion?" "Plainly," Holmes answered, his eyes gleaming. No other enterprise could justify the elaborate contrivance of the League. Tonight, when the city sleeps, our conspirators will likely attempt their enterprise. We must be ready. Lestrade shifted uneasily, as though uncertain whether to commit his men on such circumstantial evidence. Holmes, perceiving his hesitation, leaned forward. "Consider, Inspector, the alternative. If I am wrong, you have wasted a few hours. If I am right, and you neglect my warning, the loss may run to thousands of pounds, and the reputation of Scotland Yard along with it. Can you afford to take the chance?" Lestrade gave a short laugh. "You put it plainly, Mr. Holmes. Very well. I shall have 2 constables meet us at Saxe Coburg Square at midnight. If this Spaulding of yours is the rogue you think him, we shall catch him red-handed." Holmes inclined his head with satisfaction. "Excellent. Then Watson and I shall be on hand to assist. Bring lanterns, Inspector, and come prepared for a descent into the earth. I suspect the night will prove instructive." After Lestrade's departure, Holmes threw himself once more into his chair, stretching his long limbs with that air of quiet amusement he often displayed when events conspired to follow the very path he had anticipated. "You are sceptical, Watson," he said, glancing at me. "Not sceptical, Holmes," I replied, "but I confess I find it difficult to see how you can speak with such certainty upon such scant evidence. A pair of worn trousers and a hollow floor seem to me slender reeds upon which to build so bold a theory." He smiled, that thin, enigmatic smile which seemed to cloak a whole architecture of reasoning. "My dear fellow, it is not one fact, but the convergence of several. A hoax designed to remove a man for a fixed period, a shop adjoining a bank, an assistant eager to secure privacy, the signs of labour beneath the floorboards. These are not isolated trifles, they form a pattern, and once the pattern emerges, the conclusion is inevitable. You see but fragments, Watson. I perceive the whole." His words silenced me, and I could not but marvel anew at the extraordinary machinery of his intellect. The hours passed slowly, and as the hands of the clock crept towards 11, Holmes grew increasingly restless. He paced the room, consulting his watch, adjusting his revolver, and finally declaring himself ready. I armed myself likewise, for though my role was ever secondary, I had learnt from experience that danger was seldom absent when Holmes engaged his adversaries. The night was raw, the fog thick upon the streets, when our cab deposited us once more at Saxe Coburg Square. The windows of the pawn-shop were dark, and no sound issued from within. Presently Lestrade joined us with 2 uniformed constables, their boots striking firmly upon the pavement. Holmes greeted them with a curt nod, and led us to the shadowed corner from which the bank could be surveyed. For some minutes we stood in silence, the mist wreathing about us, each man straining his ears for the faintest sound. It was Lestrade who first muttered his impatience. "If you have erred, Mr. Holmes, this will prove a dreary vigil." Holmes raised a finger sharply. "Hush! Do you hear nothing?" We all listened, and at length I caught it too, a faint, rhythmic scraping, muffled yet distinct, as of metal against stone. It came from beneath the very ground on which we stood. "There," Holmes whispered, his eyes glittering. "They are at work even now. We must be ready to close the net when they emerge. Watson, your revolver. Lestrade, station your men at the rear entrance of the bank. The moment the rogues break through, we pounce." The inspector nodded briskly, his doubts forgotten, and moved off with his men. Holmes and I crouched in the darkness, the minutes stretching into an eternity, the muffled sounds growing clearer, as though the very earth breathed with malignant purpose beneath us. At last, Holmes gripped my arm. "Now we shall see them, Watson. Steady yourself, the game is afoot." His words, charged with suppressed excitement, sent a thrill through me that banished all weariness. I knew that within moments the hidden enemy would reveal himself, and that Holmes's chain of deductions, so strange and delicate, would stand or fall in the crucible of action. The square lay silent, the fog dense, the gas lamps burning dim. Yet beneath that silence pulsed the knowledge that men driven by greed and audacity were even then breaking through into what they believed to be their triumph. It was a moment of suspense so keen that my heart hammered against my ribs, and I realized once more the perilous, fascinating path along which Sherlock Holmes led those who had the fortune, or misfortune, to call him friend. The fog pressed close about us, dampening every sound save for that persistent scraping beneath the earth, a dull rhythm that seemed to echo against the very stones of Saxe-Coburg Square. Holmes crouched beside me, his thin face drawn with a strange mixture of triumph and tension, his eyes fixed upon the rear wall of the bank as though he could pierce it by will alone. I confess my own nerves were taut. Every moment seemed stretched, suspended in the haze of the night, until even the beating of my heart sounded loud in my ears. Suddenly, Holmes touched my sleeve and inclined his head. From the shadows of the pawn-shop, a faint glimmer of lantern light flickered, then was extinguished. A panel moved somewhere beyond sight, and out of the earth emerged two figures, one crawling forward with the stealth of a predator, the other following in quick succession. The first man was slight, alert, his features pale even in the darkness. The second, broader of build, his face obscured beneath the rim of a cap. Both carried the tools of their trade, mud clinging to their clothes, their movements betraying the urgency of men who believed fortune lay within their grasp. Holmes's hand gripped mine with sudden force. "Quiet, Watson." "Another moment yet," he whispered. I could feel the restrained energy in him, like a coiled spring, as the intruders advanced cautiously towards the bank's rear door. The smaller man produced a set of implements, and with practiced ease began to work at the lock. The rasp of metal upon iron was clear to us, though muffled by the fog, and I felt a thrill of mingled dread and admiration at their audacity. At Holmes's signal, Lestrade and his constables sprang from their concealment, lanterns flaring in the gloom. A shout went up, the sudden blaze of light catching the burglars in mid-act. For the briefest instant the two froze, then the taller man swung his tool with desperate violence at the nearest constable, felling him to the ground. The smaller figure darted back towards the tunnel, but Holmes was upon him in an instant, his wiry frame closing like a trap, and I too leapt forward, revolver in hand, to cut off escape. There was a furious struggle. The pale man fought with surprising strength, his eyes blazing with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but Holmes held him with the unyielding grip of iron. Lestrade and the remaining constable subdued the larger ruffian after a scuffle that left all breathless and bruised. The square rang with the noise of shouts, the clash of boots against stone, the scuffle of desperate resistance. Then all at once the tumult subsided, and the two prisoners stood bound and beaten in the lamplight. Holmes, his breath coming sharp, bent close to the smaller man and said in a low, cold voice, "You are John Clay, I perceive, murderer, thief, and forger, with blood as blue as your crimes are black. Your pedigree is one of the oldest in England, yet you stoop to crawl like a rat beneath the earth for gold that is not yours." The fellow straightened as best he could under his bonds, and for a moment I caught the flash of arrogance in his eyes. "You may call me what you will, Mr. Holmes," he said with a sneer, "but you cannot deny I would have carried it off had you not meddled." Holmes's expression hardened, yet I fancied I saw in him a trace of reluctant admiration. "Your plan was ingenious, Clay. To remove Wilson by such a contrivance, to dig in secrecy within yards of a bank vault, to employ the disguise of trivial employment. Yes, it was clever. But cleverness without foresight is a broken tool. You overlooked the worn knees of your trousers." Clay's face darkened, and he turned away, in silence. Lestrade, meanwhile, was exultant. "By George, Mr. Holmes, this is a prize indeed. John Clay himself wanted in half the counties of England. Scotland Yard will not forget this night his constables secured the prisoners, while the fallen officer, though shaken, was able to rise with little harm done. The bank's rear entrance bore the marks of attempted entry, and the yawning mouth of the tunnel lay revealed where the earth had been disturbed." Holmes stood with arms folded, surveying the scene with calm detachment, as though the tumult just past were but the inevitable conclusion of his calculations. Yet even as Lestrade congratulated himself, I noticed that Holmes's gaze lingered upon the tunnel, his brow furrowed in thought. "Watson," he murmured to me when the inspector's attention was elsewhere, "observe the width and depth of that excavation. It is the work of many weeks, perhaps months, executed with remarkable precision. Clay was the mind, no doubt, but the hand that aided him, Spaulding, as Wilson knew him, was of equal cunning. There is more here than meets the eye." I followed his gaze, but could see nothing save the dark passage and the scattered tools. "Do you mean there are others involved?" I asked. "Not others, perhaps, but another identity," Holmes replied, his voice low. "Vincent Spaulding, so-called, is none other than John Clay himself. The two are one and the same, the assistant and the conspirator, ingeniously placed under Wilson's very nose. You see the audacity, Watson, to conceal his operations beneath his employer's shop while diverting him with a sham employment. It is artistry in crime." The revelation struck me with the force of sudden clarity. The odd mixture of deference and amusement I had seen in Spaulding's eyes, the energy ill-suited to a mere assistant, the trousers worn with telltale signs, it was all there, plain as day, once Holmes had spoken. Yet until now it had lain beyond my perception, masked by the cunning simplicity of the ruse. As the prisoners were marched away under heavy guard, Lestrade could scarcely contain his satisfaction. "We shall have them behind bars before morning," he declared. "London owes you much, Mr. Holmes, though I'll see that the Yard takes proper credit. You've an uncanny knack for these things." Holmes inclined his head with mock courtesy, his lips twitching in faint amusement. "Credit is a coin I seldom covet, Inspector. Let us say only that the city sleeps in safety, and that is reward enough." We returned at last to Baker Street, the first pallor of dawn creeping into the sky above the mist. Holmes threw himself into his chair once more, stretching languidly as though the night's exertions had been no more than an evening's diversion. I, exhausted by the vigil, sank opposite him, eager to record every detail before fatigue clouded my memory. Holmes regarded me with that peculiar mixture of affection and irony which he reserved for our quietest hours. It was, you must admit, an instructive case, Watson. A reminder that in the most outlandish advertisement may lie the seed of serious enterprise, and that the smallest detail, an article of clothing, the tilt of a man's chin, may reveal the grandest design. Write it, my friend, as you will, but omit not the knees of John Clay's trousers. They were, after all, the fulcrum upon which the case turned. I smiled at the gravity with which he spoke of such trifles, though in truth I had learnt long since that in his hands no trifle was ever small. The fire flickered low, the city stirred to its day, and Holmes, his mind already passing to some new horizon, sat silent, his keen profile outlined against the growing light. The morning after the capture of John Clay and his accomplice found me in high spirits, convinced that the affair of the so-called Red-Headed League had been concluded with all neatness. Lestrade's men had secured the prisoners, the bank was saved from robbery, and Holmes had once more displayed the brilliance that set him apart from all others in the field of detection. Yet to my surprise, Holmes himself betrayed none of the satisfaction I expected. He was restless, pacing the sitting-room with long, impatient strides, his pipe forgotten upon the mantel, his violin lying silent in its case. "You are not content, Holmes?" I asked, for I could not reconcile his demeanour with the triumph of the night. He turned sharply, his eyes alight with that strange fire I had come to know. "Content, Watson? To apprehend a single rogue, when the pattern suggests a web? Number. The matter is not yet ended. Clay's scheme was daring, but I tell you it is incomplete. There is a chord missing in the harmony, a shadow that lingers where all should be clear." I confess I was perplexed. But surely, with Clay unmasked and his accomplice taken, the danger is past. The League was but a fiction, its purpose revealed, and the bank preserved. What more remains? Holmes did not answer at once. He strode to the window, threw it open to the raw morning air, and stood gazing down upon Baker Street, where costermongers were already calling their wares, and hansoms rattled past in noisy procession. At last he spoke, his voice low, almost reflective. "Clay is clever, but not careless. His capture was too easy, his resistance too slight. He yielded with a smile, Watson, and I cannot abide a smiling prisoner. It speaks of some reserve of confidence, some hidden design yet in motion. Mark me, he is but one piece of a greater game." His words unsettled me, for I had seen the gleam of triumph in Clay's eyes, even in defeat. Could it be that Holmes's suspicion was more than mere imagination? I resolved to accompany him wherever his inquiry might lead. Our opportunity came sooner than expected. By noon, a note arrived from Inspector Lestrade requesting Holmes's presence at Scotland Yard. The message was brief and urgent, hinting that some irregularity had arisen in connection with the prisoners. Holmes seized his hat at once, and we made our way through the crowded streets to the yard. There we found Lestrade in a state of agitation. "Clay and his fellow have been close-mouthed," he admitted. "But this morning a message reached me from the Bank of England. It seems that in the last fortnight large quantities of sovereigns have been disappearing from their reserves, quietly, without explanation. The directors are in a panic, and though last night's affair seems to account for some design upon their gold, the losses began before we ever laid hands on Clay. I fear we may be dealing with a larger conspiracy than we guessed." Holmes' face grew intent. "Precisely, Inspector. Clay's tunnel was but the visible limb of a deeper organism. He is not alone, and I will wager that while he amused himself with Wilson's pawn shop, another hand was already at work elsewhere." The three of us conferred in Lestrade's office, poring over the reports. The missing sums were vast, yet the thefts had been executed with such discretion that suspicion had only now been aroused. No forced locks, no broken seals, only discrepancies in the ledgers that a cautious clerk had dared to question. Holmes examined the documents with a concentration so fierce that I scarcely dared speak. At length he drew his finger along one entry and gave a short laugh devoid of mirth. "Here, Watson, note this. The signatures approving the release of funds bear subtle irregularities, minute variations in pressure and stroke, a forgery of the most accomplished kind, and whose hand is known across Europe for its skill in imitation. Clay's, I murmured. Holmes shook his head. Clay is a digger, a schemer, a man of action, but this belongs to an artist of deception, one who works with pen and parchment, not spade and pickaxe. We are in the presence of another mind altogether. Clay's arrest may be but the sacrifice of a pawn to shield the advance of the Queen. Lestrade swore under his breath. Then we have not ended the business at all. By heaven, Holmes, if you can lead us to the real mastermind, the Yard will owe you more than it can ever repay. Holmes waved away the sentiment, already lost in thought. The pattern will reveal itself, Inspector, if only we are patient. Meanwhile, keep Clay under the strictest watch. Deny him contact with the outside world. He will attempt communication, I am certain of it, and when he does, we must be ready to trace it to its source. As we left the Yard, I could see that Holmes's mood had altered. The restlessness of the morning had given way to the keen excitement of the chase renewed. He walked swiftly, his long coat billowing behind him, and I was hard-pressed to keep pace. "Do you see it now, Watson?" he asked, as we turned into Whitehall. The Red-Headed League was a jest, a distraction, but beneath it lurks something far greater. Clay's tunnel was crude, but it drew our gaze. Meanwhile, another, subtler hand has already plundered the very heart of the kingdom's treasure. We must find that hand, Watson, before it closes again. I could not but marvel at his prescience. Where I had seen conclusion, he discerned only prelude. And though a chill ran through me at the thought of an adversary more cunning than John Clay, I felt also the old exhilaration that came whenever Holmes set his mind against the hidden powers of crime. That night, as the fog once more settled upon London, Holmes prepared his instruments with meticulous care, his eyes shining with anticipation. The case, far from resolved, had deepened into a mystery that promised dangers and revelations yet undreamed. And as I set pen to paper, I knew that the adventure of the Red-Headed League was destined to grow into one of the strangest and most perilous in the annals of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's suspicions, once roused, admitted no rest. For 2 days he scarcely stirred from Baker Street, save for short and sudden excursions, whose purpose he did not disclose even to me. The sitting-room bore witness to his exertions. Maps of London banks lay spread upon the table. Pages of figures and ledgers borrowed from Lestrade were pinned against the wall, and scraps of his chemical apparatus bubbled as he tested for the faintest traces of ink alteration upon documents. I watched in silence, knowing that to interrupt him in such moods was to break the delicate web his mind was weaving. On the third evening he turned to me with a sudden brightness. "Watson, put on your thick coat. We must venture forth, and I fancy you will find our destination as instructive as it is unexpected." He would say no more, and so I followed him into the damp night. London lay wrapped in fog once again, the gas lamps glowing like hazy orbs, carriages rattling over slick stones. Holmes hailed a cab and directed the driver eastward, and after a long, circuitous journey we alighted before a modest counting-house near Cheapside. The establishment was shuttered, but Holmes moved with the confidence of a man who knew the ground. Producing a key from his pocket, he let us in by a side door and struck a match, revealing an interior filled with desks, ledgers, and shelves heavy with account books. "You appear surprised, Watson," he said with a faint smile. "This office belongs to a correspondent of the Bank of England, one who has vouched for the release of certain shipments of sovereigns. I have arranged entry with the cooperation of its proprietor, who suspects nothing amiss, yet I believe the true hand of our enemy has been at work here." He led me to a desk near the rear and held up a ledger beneath the lamplight. "Observe this signature, Watson." It purports to be that of Sir Andrew Murchison, a director of the bank. But note the hesitation at the curve, the unnatural flourish at the end. Compare it with this authentic example. I bent close, and even my untrained eye could detect a subtle difference, as if one were the echo of the other. "Clay could never have managed this," Holmes continued. "This belongs to a master forger of the highest order. And mark me, such skill is seldom plied for small ends. We are dealing with a syndicate, Watson, one that reaches into the highest echelons of finance." Even as he spoke, a faint creak came from the stair beyond the door. Holmes extinguished the lamp in an instant, and we stood in darkness, scarcely breathing. Footsteps descended, cautious yet firm, and a sliver of light showed through the crack beneath the door. Holmes's hand gripped my arm with silent intensity. The door opened a fraction, and a man slipped into the office. He was tall, cloaked, his hat pulled low, and he moved with the assurance of one familiar with the place. He went directly to the desk, drew forth the very ledger Holmes had examined, and began to replace it with another drawn from beneath his cloak. The lamplight he carried fell across his face for an instant, and I saw features sharp and severe, with eyes that glinted like steel in the gloom. Before I could move, Holmes sprang forward. "That will suffice, sir," he said, in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade. The man wheeled round, his hand darting beneath his cloak. I caught the gleam of a revolver, but Holmes was swifter. He struck the weapon aside and grappled with him. I rushed to Holmes's aid, yet the stranger fought with astonishing power, hurling us both against the desk so that papers flew in all directions. In the struggle he broke free, dashed the lamp to the ground, and plunged the room into darkness. We heard his boots pounding across the floorboards, the crash of the door as he flung it open, and then the echo of his flight up the stair and into the fog-drenched street beyond. Holmes, though winded, was laughing softly as he lit a fresh match. "Watson, did you see him? Did you mark the face?" "I did," I gasped, "but I cannot place it." "Do you know him?" Holmes's eyes shone with fierce delight. "Indeed. That was not merely a forger or clerk. That, my dear fellow, was none other than Count Victor Radomir, the so-called Prince of Shadows, a man whispered of in continental police circles as the most elusive criminal intellect of our generation. If he has joined forces with Clay, then the case is greater than I dared imagine." The name meant little to me, but the gravity in Holmes's tone sent a chill down my spine. He replaced the ledger with care and restored the room as best he could before leading me back into the night. His mind was clearly racing ahead, for he scarcely spoke until we reached Baker Street. Once within our chambers, he threw himself into his chair and clasped his hands beneath his chin. "Do you not see it, Watson? Clay's tunnel was but the diversion. While he drew our attention with spade and pickaxe, Radomir plundered the ledgers, replacing the genuine with the false. Vast sums could be siphoned away, and none the wiser until too late. Our intervention last night has forced his hand, but he is not beaten. He will strike again, and soon, I asked, with some unease, how he could hope to contend with a man of such resources and cunning. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the cold fire of the chase. By anticipating his every move. He believes himself invisible in the fog of London finance, but even a shadow must cast some outline. We shall find it, Watson. Tomorrow I shall don a disguise and make my inquiries in those haunts where Radomir is said to move, among the foreign clubs, the gaming houses, the squalid dens of Clerkenwell. He will not escape me. And so, with the dawn yet hours away, Holmes had already charted the course, of his next pursuit. The Red-Headed League, it seemed, was but the overture to a symphony of crime whose conductor remained at large, his hand moving unseen through the affairs of the city. I, for one, felt the old thrill of dread and admiration in equal measure, knowing that we were embarked upon a contest that promised to test even Holmes' indomitable genius. The following days were a blur of movement and secrecy, for Holmes entered into that fever of activity which seized him whenever he pitted himself against a mind he deemed worthy of his steel. To the casual eye he appeared absent from Baker Street for long stretches, yet I knew that every hour was bent to the pursuit of Count Radomir. When he did return, it was often in disguise, at one time a shabby clerk, at another a foreign seaman with a scarred cheek and a guttural accent. I marvelled at his powers of transformation, for even I, who knew him as no other man did, could scarcely have recognized him had I encountered him in the street. Each evening he would throw off his assumed character and sink into his armchair, his eyes alight with the fierce gleam of discovery. From him I gathered fragments of intelligence, whispers in a Hungarian cafe in Soho, a name overheard in the gambling rooms of Leicester Square, a coded message traced to a tobacconist in Clerkenwell. Piece by piece, a net of intrigue unfolded, and at its centre stood Radomir, invisible yet everywhere, directing his agents with the subtlety of a master tactician. I pressed him more than once to confide his full plan, but he only smiled, his lips curling with that mixture of affection and superiority that never failed to exasperate me. Patience, Watson. The trap must be baited before it is sprung. A premature word might cost us dearly. Radomir is no ordinary adversary. He will scent danger the moment it is spoken. It was on a raw evening, the fog heavier than ever, that Holmes revealed the first clear step of his design. He summoned me to accompany him to the Bank of England itself, where, in the solemn boardroom beneath the vaulted ceilings, we met with the anxious directors. Their pale faces betrayed the magnitude of their fears, for the missing sovereigns amounted already to a staggering sum. Holmes listened with grave courtesy, then laid before them a simple request that they permit a shipment of gold to be announced publicly for the following Friday, a consignment said to be bound for Paris under guard. The directors agreed, though uneasily, for the thought of using their treasure as bait filled them with dismay. As we walked back through the mist, I asked Holmes if he was certain Radomir would rise to the lure. Certain? No, Watson, but I count upon his vanity. He will not endure to see such wealth pass from under his very nose without stretching forth his hand. He will believe that with clay removed, his own genius is sufficient to seize the prize. That belief shall be his undoing. The intervening days were filled with preparations. Holmes arranged with Lestrade for discreet watchmen, placed his own agents in the vicinity of the docks, and vanished twice upon errands from which he returned with mud upon his boots and satisfaction in his eyes. I could only guess at the scope of his stratagem. On the appointed night, the bank's strong rooms were alive with whispered activity. Crates marked for Paris stood ready, guarded by uniformed men who feigned indifference, but whose eyes were keen. Holmes had stationed himself in a shadowed alcove, his figure tense as a drawn bow, and I was beside him, revolver in hand. The hours dragged, the silence broken only by the ticking of the great clock and the occasional shuffle of a guard's footstep. It was past midnight when the moment came. A faint rustle stirred near the rear of the chamber, where a narrow ventilator opened onto the yard beyond. A figure dropped noiselessly through the aperture, followed by another, their movements quick and precise. They glided towards the crates with the surety of men who knew their ground. In the dim light I caught the unmistakable profile of Radomir himself, his features set in cold determination. Holmes's hand pressed my arm, restraining me. He allowed them to reach the crates, to test the locks, even to signal softly to some unseen accomplice. Then, with a suddenness that made me start, Holmes stepped from the shadows, his voice ringing with authority. "That is far enough, Count Radomir. The game is ended." The intruders froze, but only for an instant. Radomir wheeled, his revolver gleaming, and a shot rang out, shattering the silence. The bullet struck the stone inches from Holmes's head. Before I could fire, chaos erupted. Lestrade and his men surged from their concealment, lanterns flared, and the chamber resounded with the clash of struggle. Radomir fought like a man possessed, his strength and agility astonishing. He struck down one constable, eluded another, and with a lithe movement sprang back towards the ventilator. For a moment it seemed he would vanish into the fog, but Holmes was upon him, grappling with a ferocity that belied his slender frame. I joined the fray, and between us we forced him to the ground. Yet even in defeat his eyes burned with a defiance that chilled me, as though he knew a secret that gave him comfort still. The remaining intruder was secured, and the chamber filled with the breathless exclamations of the guards. Lestrade, flushed and triumphant, clapped Holmes upon the shoulder. "By heaven, sir, you've done it again!" Radomir himself, London will ring with this capture. But Holmes, though outwardly composed, regarded the Count with a searching gaze. "Done it? Perhaps, Inspector, and yet—" He broke off, his expression unreadable. We returned at last to Baker Street, Radomir safely under guard, but Holmes was restless. He paced the room till dawn, pausing only to mutter fragments of deduction under his breath. Though the world would hail the matter closed, I could see that to Holmes the true heart of the puzzle still eluded him. The Count had been caught, yet the shadow he cast seemed to linger, vast and intangible, upon the fog of London. Though the newspapers the next morning blazed with headlines proclaiming the triumph of Scotland Yard and the capture of the notorious Count Radomir, I could see at once that Holmes took no pride in the victory. He sat slouched in his chair, his fingers steepled, eyes half closed, his countenance darkened by some inward disquiet. The reports scattered about our table described Radomir as a criminal genius, finally brought to heel. Yet Holmes regarded them with scarcely a glance. "You are not satisfied?" I ventured. He looked at me sharply. "Satisfied?" "No, Watson, the Count is a man of great cunning, but tell me, does it strike you as plausible that one so wary should descend in person into the lion's den? That he should risk his own skin where subordinates might serve?" His capture was almost too convenient. I reflected on the matter and recalled the strange calm in Radomir's expression as we restrained him, the defiant gleam that never left his eyes. "You think he allowed himself to be caught?" Holmes rose abruptly and paced the room. "It is possible. Indeed, I fear it is likely. A man like Radomir plays on more than one board. While we congratulated ourselves on cornering him in the bank, another piece may already have been in motion elsewhere." At that moment a knock sounded and Lestrade entered, flushed with pride. "We've him locked tight in the yard, Mr. Holmes. He'll not wriggle free this time. The Home Office is already preparing papers, and I dare say the Continent will rejoice to hear of his fall." Holmes regarded him with a smile that carried little warmth. "Keep your vigilance sharp, Inspector. Radomir is not a common thief to be cowed by iron bars. Watch for messages, for visitors, for any sign of disturbance. The true measure of this case lies not in his capture, but in whether the thefts cease." Lestrade bristled a little at Holmes's tone, but made no reply, only assuring us that no precaution would be spared. When he had gone, Holmes turned to me with sudden energy. "We must return to the ledgers, Watson. There is a strand left untied." Back at the counting house, Holmes pored once more over the records. He compared dates, traced signatures, and at length struck the table with his hand. "Just as I suspected. Observe these entries. The forgeries ceased 3 days before Radomir's arrest." "What does that tell you?" "That someone else carried them out and that person remains free," I replied slowly. "Exactly. Radomir may have directed, but he did not execute the work. He offered himself as decoy while another slipped away with the true prize. We have caught the hand that waved the flag, Watson, but not the one that plundered the vaults." The revelation chilled me. It was one thing to believe a mastermind had been captured, quite another to realize the mastermind might still be at liberty. I asked who Holmes believed this hidden player might be. He gave me a long, penetrating look. "Do you recall Jabez Wilson's assistant, Spaulding, or Clay, as he called himself? He was but the surface. Radomir, too, has his disguises, but beneath them there is yet a third figure, more elusive. During my inquiries I heard whispers of a woman known only as the Widow. She is said to move among financial circles under a veil of respectability, arranging introductions, manipulating accounts. If my deductions hold, she is the true architect, and both Clay and Radomir were but her instruments." The notion startled me, yet the logic of it seemed undeniable. "Then she may even now be at large in London, unobserved." "Precisely so, Watson. And it is there our battle lies." That night Holmes disappeared again into the fog, returning only in the early hours, weary yet triumphant. He had learned, through channels I could scarcely imagine, that a certain lady of Eastern origin had departed London that very evening by train bound for Dover, carrying with her a single trunk of unusual weight. Holmes wasted no time. By dawn we were on the trail, and at Charing Cross we boarded the first train south. During the journey he explained his reasoning. "Radomir's smile at the moment of capture, Watson, that was the key. He had fulfilled his purpose by drawing our gaze. Meanwhile, his confederate departed with the spoils. It is a game of misdirection, and we must not be the dupes. We reached Dover by mid-afternoon, the sea winds sharp in our faces, and Holmes lost no time in questioning the port officials. A woman matching the description had indeed taken passage for Calais, her trunk hastily loaded aboard. Holmes obtained the manifests and examined them with his lens. "There," he said, pointing to a curious smudge in the handwriting. "The name is false. But the weight of the trunk, overly great for a lady's effects. It contains the missing sovereigns, Watson. I would stake my reputation upon it." But the steamer had already departed, a plume of smoke receding against the horizon. For the first time in many days I saw Holmes's composure falter, his lips pressed in vexation. Yet even then his eyes kindled anew. All is not lost. She believes herself safe, but we shall follow. The game is not ended until the last piece is played. And so, as the gulls wheeled above and the sea beat ceaselessly against the harbour wall, we prepared to pursue our quarry across the channel, the mystery of the red-headed league now revealed as the prelude to a drama whose stage was no longer confined to London, but stretched into the very heart of Europe. When the channel crossing was rough, the sea heaving under a slate-grey sky, and many passengers retired below in misery. Holmes, however, remained on deck, his tall figure etched against the spray, his eyes fixed with unyielding concentration upon the east. He scarcely spoke, and I knew better than to disturb him, for his mind was already ranging far ahead, measuring probabilities, anticipating the moves of his unseen adversary. For my own part, I could not shake the image of that solitary trunk, heavy with the gold of England, slipping across the waters under the guard of a woman known only by whispers as the widow. At Calais we disembarked with haste, Holmes securing a carriage the moment we set foot upon the quay. His French, delivered with an accent so natural that the driver accepted him at once as a native, smoothed our passage. "Speed, Watson," he muttered as we clattered into the streets, "is the one advantage we possess. If the widow gains Paris unchecked, she will vanish into the labyrinth of its society, and the treasure with her." The journey inland was long, the winter landscape rolling by in a blur of hedgerows and bare fields. Holmes sat rigid, his eyes half closed, his fingers drumming restlessly upon the sill. At last, as dusk approached, the carriage delivered us to the Gare du Nord. Holmes sprang out and, after a swift exchange with a station official, returned with that gleam in his eyes which meant the trail was still warm. "She arrived scarcely an hour before us," he said. Her trunk was claimed by porters and conveyed to a carriage bound for the Rue de l'Université. That is where we shall go. Paris lay cloaked in mist, the gas lamps casting a golden haze upon the boulevards, the air alive with carriages and the hum of voices. We reached the quarter in question, a district of elegant facades and discreetly shuttered windows. Holmes dismissed our driver and led me on foot down a narrow side street, his every movement radiating purpose. At length he halted before a tall house of sober aspect, its doorway framed by wrought-iron railings. A faint glow filtered through the curtains, and the shadow of a figure passed across them. Holmes's hand pressed my arm. "There, Watson, the nest of the widow." We watched in silence until the door opened, and a woman emerged, tall and veiled, attended by a liveried servant. She stepped into a waiting carriage, which rolled away towards the boulevard. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "She departs, but she will return. Meanwhile, let us see what remains within." With astonishing swiftness he produced a slender tool from his pocket, and in moments the lock yielded. We entered noiselessly, the hall dim and richly furnished. Holmes moved like a shadow through the rooms, his lens flashing in the lamplight as he examined every surface. At last, in a study at the rear, he gave a low exclamation. A trunk stood there, its lid half open, the gleam of gold unmistakable within. "The sovereigns," Holmes whispered, "yet not all. She has divided the treasure. This is but a portion, bait to mislead. The larger part has already been dispatched." I felt a chill pass through me. "Then we are too late." "Not too late, Watson. Observe this." He held up a folded sheet of paper found upon the desk. It bore figures, dates, and a name. Antwerp. Holmes' eyes blazed. "She means to transport the remainder through Belgium, where her agents await. We must intercept her there." Even as he spoke, the sound of wheels upon the gravel reached us. Holmes extinguished the lamp and drew me back into the shadows. The door opened, and the widow herself entered. She cast off her veil, revealing a face of striking beauty, pale and severe, her eyes cold as glass. She crossed to the desk and bent over the papers. At that instant, Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting the silence. "Madam, your game is finished." She did not start nor cry out. Instead, she straightened with calm dignity, her gaze fixed upon Holmes. "So the English bloodhound has found the scent. But tell me, Mr. Holmes, do you truly believe you can cage a shadow?" Her poise, her composure in the face of discovery, was unnerving. Holmes, however, was unmoved. "The gold is here, the documents betray your scheme, and your accomplices lie already in custody. You will accompany us." She smiled faintly. Accomplices. Clay rots in a cell. Radomir plays his part. And yet I remain. Did you think I would cross the channel without provision for such contingencies? My work is done, Mr. Holmes. The gold you see is the husk. The kernel has already passed beyond your reach. At that instant, a sound like a pistol crack rang out from the street. The widow's servant flung wide the door, shouting in French, and she moved with sudden swiftness. Holmes sprang forward, but she cast a small vial to the ground, releasing a cloud of acrid smoke. Blinded, choking, we stumbled as she swept past, her skirts vanishing into the fog outside. By the time we gained the street, the carriage had already disappeared into the darkness. Holmes stood rigid, his features set in grim resolve. She slips from us tonight, Watson, but not forever. She has shown her hand too plainly. Antwerp is her haven, and there we shall end this. And so, with the lights of Paris glimmering through the mist, and the sound of the sea echoing faintly in the distance, we prepared to follow our quarry once more. The chase, far from ended, had only tightened its coils, and I knew that the struggle between Holmes and the widow was destined to reach its climax on foreign soil, with the fate of a nation's treasure hanging in the balance. The pursuit into Belgium was one of the most breathless journeys of my life. From Paris to Brussels, and thence to Antwerp, Holmes drove us onward with unrelenting urgency, his eyes glittering with that fever of the chase which I had come to recognize as both his greatest strength and his most dangerous compulsion. We travelled light, carrying only what we could bear, for Holmes feared each delay was another hour in which the widow might vanish into the labyrinth of Europe with her ill-gotten fortune. Antwerp greeted us with a pall of smoke drifting from its chimneys and the clangour of shipyards echoing across the Scheldt. Holmes wasted no time in surveying the city. At the customs house he produced a note of introduction, and within minutes was poring over manifests of cargo bound for Amsterdam, Hamburg, and points further east. His concentration was so intense that the clerk who attended him scarcely dared to breathe. "There, Watson," he said at last, tapping a column with his forefinger. A consignment declared as machine parts, weight exceeding that of the listed crates by several £100. It departed Paris only yesterday, under the supervision of a woman using the name V. Radova. Our quarry has laid her trail as plainly as if she had signed her name. That evening, we made our way to the docks where the chill wind whipped through the rigging and the dark waters slapped against the stone. Holmes had arranged with the Belgian authorities for a discreet cordon, though he warned me that Radomir's network was vast and might already have compromised them. We watched the wharves with anxious vigilance, lanterns bobbing in the fog, sailors calling out in guttural tongues. It was near midnight when Holmes touched my arm. "Look there." Out of the mist came a closed carriage, stopping at the far end of the quay. A tall figure alighted, veiled still but unmistakable in bearing. The widow moved with stately composure towards a warehouse where the suspect crates had been stored. Two men joined her, rough fellows armed with cudgels, their eyes darting nervously in the gloom. Holmes signalled softly, and the authorities crept into position. Yet before they could act, the widow raised her hand, and one of the men swung open the warehouse door. Inside, by the flare of a lantern, I glimpsed the gleam of gold sovereigns, hastily repacked into canvas sacks. She had intended to load them aboard a waiting vessel under cover of darkness. Holmes stepped forward then, his voice cold and commanding. "The game is over, madam." The house of cards has collapsed. The widow turned, her veil falling back. Even in that dim light her beauty struck me with its chill brilliance. She did not flinch nor cry out, but only regarded Holmes with disdain. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, but cleverness is not victory. These men are loyal to me. Do you think your handful of officers can withstand them?" At her gesture, the ruffians drew knives, and a fierce struggle erupted. Blows rang out, the clash of steel upon steel resounded in the cavernous space. I fired my revolver into the air, the report echoing like thunder, and the Belgian constables surged forward with renewed force. In the melee I saw Holmes himself grapple with one of the brutes, striking him down with a precision that bespoke both calculation and fury. The widow attempted to slip away in the confusion, her skirts sweeping through the shadows, but Holmes anticipated her flight. He cut her off at the doorway, his tall figure blocking the path, revolver steady in his hand. For the first time her composure wavered, and she halted, her chest rising and falling with quickened breath. "Yield," Holmes said quietly. "There is no escape." Her eyes flashed with sudden fire. "No escape? You think iron bars will hold me? Men greater than you have tried to bind me, and still I walk free." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Perhaps. But tonight, madam, you will not walk away with England's gold." The officers closed in, and at last the widow allowed the revolver to be taken from her gloved hand. The fight subsided, the cries of the captured echoing against the stones, and the sacks of sovereigns lay scattered across the floor, their golden gleam a silent witness to the scale of her ambition. As dawn broke over the Scheldt, the prisoners were conveyed under heavy guard, and Holmes and I stood upon the quay, weary yet exultant. The masts of ships rose like forest pines against the pale sky, and the city stirred to its morning labours. "You have done it, Holmes," I said, with heartfelt admiration. "The treasure is safe, the conspiracy unmasked. All Europe will know of this day." He gave a short laugh, tinged with melancholy. "Done it, Watson? We
have averted disaster, yes, but do not mistake the victory for completeness. Radomir and Clay will rot in cells, the widow faces trial, yet the underworld will not slumber. Crime is a tide that ebbs only to surge again. We are but men with buckets upon the shore." I could not deny the truth of his words, yet I felt pride nonetheless at what we had achieved. The Red-Headed League, absurd in its beginning, had proved the cloak for one of the boldest financial plots of our time. And once again it was the genius of Sherlock Holmes that had pierced the veil of deception and restored safety where all seemed lost. As we made our way back to London in the following days, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, gazing out of the carriage window with eyes that seemed fixed on some distant horizon. At last, he murmured, as if to himself, "There is no final victory, Watson. Only the next move." And I, watching him with the affection of long years, knew that whatever shadows lay ahead, I should follow him still, content to chronicle the feats of the most singular mind that ever walked the streets of Baker Street. Our return to Baker Street marked the closing of one of the most elaborate cases it has been my privilege to record. The journey from Antwerp to London was subdued, for though the newspapers abroad clamoured with accounts of the arrest and the recovery of the treasure, Holmes remained withdrawn, his thoughts turned inward as if tracing patterns invisible to my eye. It was only after several days, when the reports had quieted and the Yard congratulated itself on its success, that my friend finally gave voice to the chain of reasoning which had carried us from a pawn shop in Saxe-Coburg Square to the quays of Antwerp. He began quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "From the first moment Wilson sat before us with his tale of the Red-Headed League, Watson, I perceived a contrivance. No enterprise so absurdly limited could exist without darker purpose. Clay's worn knees and hollow floor, the contiguity of the bank, These revealed the outline of a tunnel. Yet I suspected even then that the affair was too artful for Clay alone. The dissolution of the League coincided too neatly with the timing of the attempted robbery. It bespoke a mind that delights in theatre, one that manipulates appearances as much as events. I nodded, remembering the strange smile that had lingered upon Clay's lips, even in defeat. Precisely, Holmes continued. Clay was but a pawn, and Radomir his knight, moving with deceptive swiftness across the board. The forgeries at the Bank of England pointed to a hand beyond theirs, a hand that never dirtied itself with the earth of a tunnel nor the ink of a ledger. That hand was the widow's. Her genius lay in misdirection. She contrived that we should seize Clay and Radomir, imagining the game won while she bore away the true prize. Yet vanity betrayed her. She could not resist gathering the
sovereigns herself, and so we trapped her at Antwerp. He leaned back, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon some distant horizon beyond our modest sitting room. It was a perilous business, Watson, and one that reveals a truth I have often told you, that crime, like genius, delights in complexity. Yet complexity may be unravelled by the patient thread of logic, if only one holds fast to the smallest clue. I could not withhold my admiration. Your foresight was extraordinary, Holmes. From the knees of a pair of trousers to the vaults of Europe's banks, there is no arc your mind cannot trace. He smiled faintly with that touch of irony that ever tempered praise. You are too kind, my dear fellow. Yet remember, it is not brilliance that triumphs, but observation joined with reason. Where others see accident, I see design. Where others see confusion, I see order. That is all. There was silence between us then, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The case was ended, the culprits secured, and England's gold restored. Yet I confess I felt a pang of melancholy, for I knew Holmes well enough to recognize that his mind already strained against the quiet. For him, resolution was not rest, but only the prelude to fresh endeavour. At last he rose, crossing to the window. The fog of London pressed thick against the glass, the lamps glowing faintly in the gloom. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, his figure etched in silhouette against the pale light. "Do you know, Watson," he said softly, "there is a curious poetry in the matter. A league that never was, a tunnel that led to nothing, a prisoner who smiled in defeat, and a lady who thought herself mistress of shadows, all undone by the simple truth that no man nor woman may escape the consequences of design. The world believes crime to be chaos. I find it rather a distorted form of art, and one which I am privileged to decipher." I could find no reply, for his words carried with them both the pride of mastery and the solitude of one who lives ever apart from the common throng. We sat together until the fire burned low, and I marvelled once more at the singular fate which had placed me at the side of so remarkable a man. Thus ended the affair of the Red-Headed League, beginning in comedy, unfolding in deception, and concluding in the triumph of logic over guile. And though Holmes himself would dismiss it as but one among many, I cannot help but set it down as among the most memorable of our adventures, for in it were displayed not only the audacity of crime, but the inexhaustible genius of Sherlock Holmes. Would you like me to also provide a short epilogue reflection in Watson's voice, styled like Doyle's canonical outros, to close the narrative on a final note of admiration and philosophical calm?